Hello and welcome to the Introduction to Psychology lecture on memory. I split this lecture up into two halves. The first half is types of memory, and the second half is remembering and forgetting. In the first half on types of memory, we're going to define memory, we're going to look at different types of memory, we're going to talk about encoding, and we're going to finish up with problems with memory. So first we have to define memory. So what is memory? Memory, it should be pretty simple to think about. It should be something that most of you know, or all of you should know, but let's put a definition to it. So memory is an active system that allows people to retain information over time. So you see here, there's some things going on in this picture here. There are some things with memory to be concerned with, which we'll be coming to, but the whole entire process of memory is basically listed here. There isn't all the different types of memory, but there's the different essentially stages. So you start with a stimuli. The stimuli is something in the environment that then goes into sensory memory. Sensory memory is something fairly small, 3 to 7 units of information and very brief in duration, typically about a half a second in duration. Then an important component of memory that we will talk about later, but many people miss, is attention. Without attention, what goes into sensory memory doesn't actually go beyond that. If you don't focus your attention on something, you don't notice it. How does that work, or what am I saying by that? Basically, you've got a lot of information coming into your vision sensory memory. Everything that is out there in the world around you, or at least in front of you, is coming into your senses. And it's actually going into your sensory memory, and your sensory memory is processing it. However, you don't actually notice it until the attention step comes in. So we'll talk about that more later and look at attention. Then you've got here working memory, also short-term memory. We'll look at the differences between short-term and working memory, how some consider them the same thing, how some consider them two slightly different related things, but we'll look at that, short-term or working memory. That has a limited capacity as well, about 7 chunks of information, and its duration is fairly limited, 5 seconds up until, as long as you keep rehearsing something, and that's what you see at the top. Rehearsal, if you keep rehearsing it, as in you keep thinking about it. If you keep thinking about it, then it'll stay in your short-term memory longer. As long as you keep thinking about it, it can stay in your short-term memory. And then from there, you encode these memories, or some of them, whichever ones you are trying to remember or your mind deems as important. You encode them into long-term memory. But also of import is retrieving things from long-term memory back into working memory so that we can think about things not just with the information from our senses, but also from the information we've learned over our lifetime. Long-term memory is basically relatively infinite amount of storage. It's not quite infinite, but as far as we're concerned for this class, its capacity is infinite and its duration is essentially permanent. There's some caveats to that we'll come back to, though. When we talk about memory, though, we have to look at the information processing model. So it looks at the mind like a computer. And when we look at the mind like a computer, we look at the processes of encoding, storing, and retrieving as important. Let's get back to that. Encoding, storing, and retrieving is important. Now, why is that important? Well, because that's how we use computers as well. What computers are, the way computers work is we're interested in how things are encoded into the computer, how things are stored, how things are retrieved from that storage, that type of thing. And we look at the mind in a way like that when we deal with memory. And it has aided in the research on memory. So let's look at those. So encoding is the first thing. So Encoding is when we're talking about making mental representation, or basically, yeah, making mental representations of the information so that it can be placed in a memory. So where we take the information and essentially process it. So it's almost like the processor, the encoding. Then we get storage. This is where we place that encoded information. It's now been processed. We now understand it. So we've encoded it. It's come into the system. We now have it in storage. So it's placed the encoded information in a relatively permanent storage. So again, just like a computer, you've got this encoding, getting it into the system, storage, putting it into long-term storage. But also of import is retrieving, and that's getting the information that has been placed into storage back into working memory so that you can think about it. If you store a memory and you can't retrieve it, it's not worth anything. So just as important as the storage is the retrieval. There are three main types of memory. So we're going to look at stages here. So the first is sensory memory. This is the initial process. This is what receives the information from the environment. This is our senses. So we talked about the senses last week. This is how now the senses actually have a memory capacity built into them. When you see something in your vision, it stays in your vision for a brief period of time. It's not immediately lost. It's why, so it can be from instantaneous to several seconds, but it's why, like if you look at a clock, sometimes when you look at a clock, the seconds hand seems like it'll stay on the second for longer. That's part of that's because of the way sensory memory works, and part of it's because of the way our mind works in such a way that we actually backlog stuff, or we construct things back in time. I'll come back to that later when we're talking about cognition, but sensory memory is important because it allows us to basically keep the information there to think about it. Audio sensory information is an interesting one here when we think about it, because this is the one where somebody is talking to you and you're not really listening, and then they stop talking and you can think back then on the information they were talking about. Well, that's because it was still in sensory memory, so it can stay there for a brief amount of time. The next important component is short-term memory. We'll talk about working memory in a minute, but for now we're going to talk about short-term memory. So short-term memory is a process that holds information for a limited amount of time. Essentially, we look at short-term memory as 2 to 30 seconds if you don't have rehearsal. Talked before on the previous slide about rehearsal, but if you are not like actively trying to focus on the information, it's only going to stay in the mind for up to about 30 seconds. You can keep something in short-term memory indefinitely as long as you keep thinking about it, though. And short-term memory holds about 7 chunks of information, which we will come back to later as well. The next thing to talk about is long-term memory, and this is where we basically take that information and put it into a long-term store. So it's something, if we actively try and remember something, or if our mind deems something as important enough, it goes into this long-term store for retrieval later. Let's look at, within sensory memory, there's 2 different basically types of memory that we're going to look at for sensory memory. The first is iconic memory. Iconic memory is vision. So it's going to be sensory memory that for visual information. It holds information, like I said, for about a quarter of a second, but when you shift your attention away, it disappears. And even in iconic memory is kind of even beyond that, where in a lot of information that's hitting the senses is not even processed into full memory. if you don't focus attention on it. We'll come back to attention again later, but for now, note that a lot of information that hits sensory memory is in it for just the briefest amount of time unless you focus attention on it. So iconic memory is really that very brief visual. Then you have echoic memory, which is auditory memory. And this actually holds it for slightly longer than the visual information, the visual memory. So echoic memory is longer than iconic memory. Echoic memory is about 1 to 2 seconds, sometimes even a little bit more. And really what's going on here is it's holding speech sounds long enough to know that a sequence of certain sounds forms words. If we didn't hold things in echoic memory the way we do, then you wouldn't be able to recognize a long word as being all part of one word. If it's just brief pieces of information, we wouldn't be able to tie them together from the beginning to the end. So that's why echoic memory especially has a longer duration. And like I said, if somebody is saying something to you, you weren't paying attention, but then they stop talking and you're like, oh, I've got to respond to them, and you can quickly think back of what they were saying, that's because it was still in your echoic memory.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Okay, the air conditioner turned off. That's pretty good. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me better now without that feedback. That last video is really interesting in that it shows us how attention is important for memory. When you were watching that video, all of the stuff that was going on in the video was going into your sensory memory, but because your attention was focused on one thing, you may not have noticed the other things going on. Even if it was going into sensory memory, it wasn't going into short-term memory and working memory. So attention is important in getting from that step of sensory memory into short-term memory. Now let's look at short-term memory itself. So short-term memory, and we'll look at working memory in just a second, but short-term memory again holds this limited amount of information. And it's an average of 7 items. We'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide, but about 7 items, and it's 7 chunks of items. And again, for about 2 to 30 seconds, unless you are rehearsing the information. Then you also have working memory. And like I said, some researchers consider these to be the same thing. Some consider them to be two related or closely related systems. But working memory is where you have active processing of the information that's coming into the senses, as well as information you've retrieved from long-term memory. So whereas short-term memory, we're just talking about this memory hold. Working memory is where you're manipulating the information to actively process or think about it. So short-term memory might be like remembering a sequence of numbers. Working memory, doing math in your head. So there's, again, some scientists view them, or some researchers view them as the same thing, just different mechanisms for the same thing. Other researchers look at them as two closely related but separate things. Just note that when we're talking about short-term memory itself, just by itself, we're talking about the short-term storage of information. When we're talking about working memory, we're talking about the short-term processing of information. As I said, short-term memory has a limited duration, So it's 2 seconds to rehearsal. What I mean by that is it lasts anywhere from 2 seconds, sometimes up to 30 seconds even without rehearsal, up until the point of rehearsal stops. And maintenance rehearsal is where you intentionally repeat information so that it remains in short-term memory longer. If you're thinking about it, not just maintenance rehearsal, but any type of active thinking or processing about the information will keep it in your short-term memory longer. When you are distracted, when something comes up and shifts your attention, when you start thinking about something else, it will go away in about 2 to 30 seconds. Then we've got limited capacity, and I really like this chunk 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. You can see that on the right here, that if you look at the 5, and so on this chart, these percents are the percent of people that can remember that many chunks of information. And when I say a chunk of information, I'll actually look at that a little bit later on how chunking works, but for now, just look at pieces of information. You've got 7 pieces of information, but this percent here is the percent of people that can remember that many pieces of information. At 5 pieces of information, about 100% of people can remember. Some people who have damage to their brain, who've had strokes, things like that, are at less than 5. But for the vast majority of people, basically 100% of people that don't have those types of damage, you can remember 5 chunks of information. And then you get up here at 9, and you're only at about 20%. Even at 10, above 9 pieces, you're looking at less than 10% of people that can do 10 or more chunks of information. So that's where that 7 plus and minus 2 comes in, where the majority of people, 70% of people can do 7, 85% can do 6, 100% can do 5, all the way up to about 15 to 20% that can do 9. So this is essentially how many pieces of information you can remember. And interference is a thing that comes in here. That is, when new information enters your short-term memory, it will push out information that's already there. And it isn't necessarily first in, first out. What I mean by that is it isn't the first information that came in is what you forget. It is kind of basically on importance in some ways on what information gets forgotten. If you're trying to remember a sequence of numbers, it isn't necessarily the first number that you forget when the last one comes in. There's more to it than that. But let's get to that chunking thing I was talking about. So chunking is where we combine separate items of information into larger units. And so when I keep saying 7 chunks of information, I don't mean 7 pieces of information. If I gave you this 7, 5, 3, 6, 8, 1, 5. That is 7 pieces of information. If I asked you to remember that, that would be, most people would be able to remember that 7536815, 7536815. You can keep rehearsing it. You can just keep it in your short-term memory by keeping rehearsing, but you've got these 7 pieces of information, 7536815. However, you can also chunk these together. Let's say we instead think 75, 3, 68, 15. Now we've got 4 chunks of information. We could then add more information to our mind now that we have these 4 chunks. I'm going to erase that 7 and rewrite it. So we've got 4 chunks of information now, 75, 3, 68, and 15. We can now add pieces of information, more chunks of information beyond these 7 numbers because we've now chunked some of them together. How about we do 753, an easy chunk to remember because you're going down by 2s, so it's 7 then 5 then 3. 68, you're going up by 2s, 15. You're now down to 3 chunks. So you can add 4 more pieces of information. And sometimes you might even be able to add all of these together. Through practice, you become better at chunking certain things. So somebody who works with numbers a lot, to them, they might look at this as 7,536,815. That is now one chunk of information in their head, and they can work with other chunks. And this is how some people do math in their head easier than others, because they're able to chunk the numbers together easier in their head, which allows them to keep more information in their brain. Whatever you become a specialist in your life, so let's say you become a doctor, or you become an engineer, or whatever it is you become a specialist in, you become an expert at that. By becoming an expert at that, you get better at chunking in that field. So by being better at chunking in that field, you are able to process information in your related field easier. And that is one of the advantages to being an expert in a field, is you can chunk more individual pieces of information into one chunk. Therefore, you can hold more information in general in your short-term and working memory. The next thing we're going to look at is long-term memory. This is the true storage part of encoding, storage, and retrieval. So long-term memory, and this is where many movies get it wrong. So movies will talk about, and we'll talk about amnesia in just a little bit, and memory problems, but movies will talk about having things like short-term memory loss. Well, that is incorrect. That person has long-term memory loss. Short-term memory loss would only be loss of memory for about 30 seconds. Long-term memory loss is losses of chunks of time, because long-term memory is anything that goes beyond that initial short-term memory, anything beyond that initial 30 seconds or so, into essentially retrieval for the rest of your life. Yes, there are damages to the brain that can cause problems with that. There are problems with retrieval that we'll get to later, but the point is that when we put information into long-term memory, it is in there for an extended period of time. We already talked essentially about what's going on in this slide, how you've got attention that's coming from sensory memory, puts things into short-term memory, then we rehearse, which encodes it for storage. Anything not encoded is forgotten. Anything that is encoded is then put into long-term memory here, and then you have retrieval from there. So long-term memory is the process of storing almost unlimited amounts of information. I'm not going to say it's unlimited. It's not infinite like the one said, but it's relatively unlimited. Essentially, it can store. We found that the mind can keep storing more and more information as long as you've got neurons to make connections. And one of the nice things about that is that neurons making connections actually help us categorize stuff and makes things easier. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So we store unlimited or almost unlimited amounts of information for long periods of time, with basically the purpose of being there for retrieving in the future. And then retrieval is the process of selecting information from long-term memory and transferring it back into short-term memory. And this can be an issue. Just because you can't remember something doesn't mean it's not in long-term memory. It could be in long-term memory, you're just having trouble retrieving it. So the process of retrieval is a separate process. And you can look at this like if you forgot something. Let's say you can't remember what it was. You went to do something, and you walked through a doorway, and you forgot what it was you went to do. Well, it's not that you it's not in your memory. That information is not absent from your long-term memory. It's that your retrieval is having an error, so you're not able to pull it from long-term memory. Hence why if you think about it, or if you're doing something else, all of a sudden it'll come to you. Well, then the retrieval worked at that point in time, even though it didn't at a previous point in time. And we're going to look at some other things when we look at like associations, brain associations, things like that. I just want to kind of give a one of those kind of study tips. One of the things that will aid you in every class you take in college and aid you in remembering things in the future. One of the things we know for memorization, how do we remember things? There are certain things that will make memorization earlier. We'll talk about some of them throughout these slides, but one I just want to bring up real quick because I just hinted at it, is that brain associations in our mind. That is why if you look at my steps for studying for tests, one of the steps is to read the chapter before watching the lecture or before coming to class if you go to class and being present for the lecture. Why is that way? Why does that aid in memory? Well, not only are you getting repeated opportunities to put something into memory, but when you're reading the chapter, your mind is creating a framework. It's creating associations. And then once you actually go to class, you fill it in, and now those associations are stronger, and you can more easily retrieve that information. That is again why we were talking for a minute there about how experts are better at chunking information. Experts are better at remembering information in their field as well, because they have a mental framework already in place. They have associations already in place, so it's easier for them to put information into long-term memory relating to what they're an expert in. So features of long-term memory: large capacity, relatively permanent. The chances of retrieval, though, depend on how the information was encoded and how much interference occurred at the time of encoding. So we talked about interference in short-term memory, and that's how new information can push out old information, push out already existing information. Interference also works when we're dealing with encoding into long-term memory as well. And that is that if you're in a environment with distractions, if you're thinking about multiple things at the same time, if there's something else going on, any of that can interfere with the memories being encoded into long-term memory properly. And then the last thing, and we'll look at this a few different times, but one of the I would say most important takeaways that I have from talking about memory is that our memories are not always as accurate as we believe. Now, I wanted to do this week's discussion as talk about a false memory that you have. The problem there is most people don't realize they have false memories. When we get to false memories, I'll talk about some of the ones I know I have, and the point is because memories are, there's a lot of problems with memories. There's a lot of problems that can come with encoding into memories, and there's a lot of problems that can come with retrieving, as well as when you re-encode information. That is, if you think about something after the fact, and then it comes up, and then you store it into long-term memory again, when you pull it out again, you may have re-encoded with errors there. So it's just one of those things to be aware of. Our memories are not as accurate as we believe, but we'll come back to that. Couple of issues with long-term memory and storage of long-term memory. We've got two effects, and these are position effects, and that is the primacy effect. That is, we better recall information that was presented at the beginning of a body of information, and then we also have the recency effect. We better recall information that was presented at the end of a body of information. So if I gave you a series of words, and let's say I gave you 15 words, the first word I give you and the last word I give you are the two that you're most likely to remember. And even then, sometimes the first and the second and the last two, sometimes one in the middle. There's a little bit of a spike in the middle, but the point is that Uh, if all words are equal, and I don't mean all words are the same, but if all words are valued equally in the mind, then the ones at the beginning and the ones at the end are the most likely that you will remember when asked to remember it later. Maybe I give you a list of 15 animals, and then we do a different task, so we clear your short-term memory. By doing a different task, we have distracted you so it's out of your short-term memory. The only thing you'll remember are things that went into your long-term memory. Then I do a recall task and ask you to recall all the animals you listed. You're, again, most likely to do the ones at the beginning and the end, or, and we'll talk about this a little bit, information that's important. So animals that maybe are important to you. Maybe you really like frogs, so you'll remember frog over because you'll remember that that was there. So one of the things that helps is how important information is, how valued we have the information. But we'll come back to that and talk about it later. I said that there were a bunch of different types of memory. So we looked at the memory systems, sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, but now let's look at types of memory within these systems. Specifically, we're looking at types of memory in long-term memory, but it's throughout the system where these are separated. The first we're going to look at is declarative versus procedural, or declarative versus non-declarative. So declarative versus procedural. Declarative memory is memories for facts, events, scenes, stories, words, any conversation you had, faces, dailies, events. So we've got a big or an extended grouping we're going to look at here. And we'll break these down actually because they're within declarative memory. There's different categories. But declarative memory is your consciously known memory, your explicit memory. And that's another thing you can look at this, explicit versus implicit. So explicit memory, declarative memory, is your consciously known memory. It is which, again, the memory for facts, events, scenes, that's as stories, conversations. So it's not just facts and events, but it's also your life events. Then you have procedural or non-declarative memory, which is going to be things like memory for motor skills, your cognitive skills, not necessarily information, but your skills, emotional behaviors, things you've learned through classical conditioning. These are implicit, as in they're not consciously known. We don't consciously think about these things. When you're first learning a new skill, it is more declarative. So when you're first learning, let's say, how to swing a tennis racket, you learn, basically, you're actively thinking about holding the racket, swinging the way you are, hitting the ball, and then getting angles, things like that. You're actively thinking about it. But as you become better at it, as you do it more and more, it becomes procedural, and it is, in a sense, instinctual or implicit. It isn't something you actively think about to do. The next two types of memory we're going to talk about are both within declarative memory. So we just looked at declarative memory, and I kind of differentiated them in that, but there's two different types within declarative memory, within explicit memory. The first is our semantic memory. This is our memory of facts, concepts, words, definition, language rules, all of these types of things. It is essentially, if you go to do trivia, this is what you're pulling off from mostly. When you're dealing with people, their name, things like that. That's semantic memory. It's a memory of or knowledge of facts. Whereas episodic memory is our memory of events. So personal experiences, episodes. So when you the naming and describing a favorite restaurant is kind of in there. Movies that you've watched, songs, but even then that can go into semantic memory. I'll come back to that later because that's important. Some of your habits can be in semantic memory, but your episodic memory is essentially episodes or personal experiences from your life. And there is a lot of overlap between the two of these. Like I just said, the names of people you know, the names of people you know well, should be something that would be in semantic memory, whereas episodic memory is more of the memories you have with that person. Even if their name is part of the episodes, it still overlaps into semantic memory. When we watch the video of Clive later, you'll see a perfect example of that. And when you get to that video, if I don't remind you right before it, note that Clive has Clive has good semantic memory, but he doesn't have episodic memory. And that is one big thing about how we know, or why we know these are two different systems, because there are people who have one but not the other of these systems. And that goes back to, how do we know about all these different memory systems? And when we look at cognitive and the different cognitive systems, how do we know that? Well, we look at people who have had damage to their brains and see if we've got a dissociation. A single dissociation means that they've got, let's say in this, somebody has a semantic memory but no episodic memory. And a double in a single dissociation, a semantic memory but no episodic, or an episodic but no semantic. A double dissociation is where you've got instances in both directions, meaning you've got at least one instance of somebody with a semantic without an episodic memory, and you've got at least one instance of somebody with an episodic without a semantic memory. And pretty much all of these we've been talking about, all of these systems, researchers have found double dissociations, meaning they've found instances where people have active one part of their memory but a defective another part, and the reverse is true as well. So when we get to Clive, Clive has semantic memory, but he does not have episodic memory. So let's look at that encoding or transferring component. So the encoding is where you transfer information from short-term into long-term memory. You do that by paying attention to it. Sometimes repeating it, rehearsing it, that type of thing, or just forming new memories when we're looking at things like episodes in our life. Those go into long-term memory without rehearsal, but they depend on other things. So let's look at those other things. First is automatic encoding. This is where we transfer information from short to long-term memory without any effort. So without any awareness. And really what's going on here with automatic encoding is this is information either the brain deems to be important without conscious thought. It's information that the brain associated without even thinking about it. It's if we're strong with emotions, automatic encoding can occur. So various different things that can cause automatic encoding. You did not try and remember what you ate for dinner today or yesterday, but you can think about it and you may be able to pull it up. But you may not. It may not have gotten encoded. But it's there, it just, maybe it didn't become important enough. How about where you ate dinner? That's a good thing because most people can think of, okay, well, I was here. So that becomes easier, and that's an automatic encoding. Whereas effortful is where we put information from short-term to long-term memory by working to memorize it, working to remember it. We can do it by making associations between old and new information. We can do it by rehearsing. We can do it in various different ways, we can try and get that information in there. You may read the chapter 2-3 times. You may try and associate what you're learning now with what you've known before. Things like that. If you're trying to memorize a new term, you may say that term over and over in your head. The point is effortful encoding takes work. So along those lines, what are some things you can do? Well, one of them is maintenance rehearsal. That's just simply repeating or rehearsing the information over and over and over again to basically put it in a long-term memory. This essentially is the tool on how we keep things in short-term memory, but it doesn't work that good for transferring things into long-term memory. However, elaborative rehearsal, this is where when we're doing effortful rehearsal, effortful memory, effortful encoding, but we're doing it in a way where we're making meaningful associations between new information and old familiar information that's already stored in long-term memory so that it's easier to retrieve. The more elaborate we rehearse something, the more we associate it with something already in our mind, the easier it is. You see over here on the right, you can just see a couple ways to remember. Let's say you have to remember a cow. Well, we might be thinking about it as a living thing. So you might associate it with some other living thing. Or you might associate it with food. So you associate it with something else that you eat. There is different ways to do this elaborative rehearsal. And there are actually different standards for associations that have been found. The old golden standard for association was associating something with something relating to happiness was about the best way to do elaborative rehearsal. It's actually been found that there's better ways to do it. Associating something with survival has actually been found the best way to memorize something. But associating things with already formed structures for the material that you're learning is far and away the best way to learn something when you're learning like in a class. If I asked you to remember a list of words, there's better ways to do it. Like I said, you associate those words with survival, you'll remember those words much better than anything else. But if you're talking about, like, let's say the definition of elaborative rehearsal, if you're trying to remember that, it's best to associate it with something else already in your mind. So you associate it with, well, you're transferring information from short-term to long-term. It's not easy, it's a difficult thing, it's elaborate, it's an elaborative process, and you have to just think about things over and over again or make associations. That's where the elaborate rehearsal comes in. I hope that makes sense. Levels of processing is also something that's important. So I already mentioned this before and briefly about how interesting information is. Well, we remember information that is basically deeper, has a deeper processing. So it's part of it's how interesting it is, but part of it is how deeply we process it. So if you just rehearsal. If you just are rehearsing the list of words over and over again, that's very shallow processing. You're not going to remember it that well. However, if I give you a list of words and then I ask you to associate those lists of words with things in your room, that's a deeper processing. You're going to remember it easier. If I even get you to the deepest processing, again, what's been found used to be happiness or relating them to positivity. Now it's survival things. Again, evolutionary is going to make sense that it's survival things, but relating to survival type things, that's the deepest type of processing. That's the things you're going to remember the best. On the next slide is a video talking about memory and different issues with memory. Enjoy.
Think back to some meaningful experience you had in the past. Try to recall the details of the event, where you were, who else was there, what you saw, and what you heard. Are you confident that those memories are accurate? Would you testify to them in court? Now imagine that you're a member of the jury at a criminal trial, and you're listening to the testimony of a witness to the crime. She seems very confident as she describes the details of what she saw and heard. If you're convinced that she's not lying, do you therefore assume that everything she says must be true? Most of us never doubt that the events we remember actually happened. and that they happened just as we remember them. Are we right to have faith in our own memories and in the memories of others? Let's hear from psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, one of the leading experts on the phenomenon of reconstructive memory. A car is speeding on a college campus, and you are one of two eyewitnesses. Afterwards, the two of you discuss what you saw. How might the discussion affect your memory? And how does eyewitness memory relate to this man's story, a story about kidnapping and murder? And how do we explain this woman's false memory, that as a child she was lost and afraid? Cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus says to answer these questions we need to understand how memory works. Loftus says memory is changeable, malleable, and that we reconstruct it over time.
You don't just record the event and then play it back later the way a videotape would work. The process is much more complex. And one of the things that affects memory and the accuracy of memory is new information or new details or new ideas that come along after some experience is completely over.
So after witnessing this on-campus driving, the two eyewitnesses might have different opinions as to what happened. One might have inaccurate, misleading information, and that could influence the other.
That misleading information can enter their memory system and can cause an alteration or a distortion or a contamination in memory. They start to believe that they experienced the misinformation themselves.
In the laboratory, Loftus's early research demonstrated this. After a subject watched a car go through a stop sign, simple suggestions by an experimenter convinced many that the car had gone through a yield sign.
We can do that fairly easily.
And in the real world, when a police officer says to an eyewitness,
"Mrs. Jones said it happened this way, what do you think?"
the suggestion that Mrs. Jones might be right can influence eyewitness memory.
So people have to be careful in all kinds of situations that they don't contaminate the memories of individuals from whom they're trying to get good information.
In fact, a guideline to police from the Justice Department suggests
you separate witnesses. You don't let them overhear what each other says because of this problem of potential contamination.
Eyewitness memory contamination affected the life of Howard Haupt. Tried for kidnapping and murdering a child, a jury acquitted him, in part because Loftus testified that police questioning may have altered eyewitness memory. But countless others are not as lucky, ending up in jail for years for crimes they did not commit.
When you analyze those cases, the most common reason for a wrongful conviction is faulty eyewitness memory. Somebody testified as a witness about their memory, and that memory was wrong, and it led to an innocent person being convicted of a crime that they didn't do. But memory is even more malleable than that. You can get people to believe that they've had entire experiences when they were younger that they didn't have.
Mommy, where are you? I can't find you.
This woman is writing about being lost as a child.
The next thing I knew, I was surrounded by strangers and got really scared. I cried for my parents, and someone noticed me and took me back to them.
In fact, she was never lost. But listen to what the experimenter says when first meeting her.
Today I'd like you to write about some experiences from your childhood. I talked with your parents about this, and they told me some specific events that happened to you.
Erin's parents were contacted, and they did suggest some real experiences, like a special birthday party. But they also said Erin was never lost. The experimenter made this up to demonstrate the power of suggestive information. The memory of being lost results from the suggestion that parents said it really happened. Widely known as the Lost in the Mall study, since that's where subjects are usually told they were lost, the taller bars show that over 3 separate sessions, 68% of subjects remembered the real experiences provided by their parents.
But the shorter bars show you the percentage of subjects who remember something about the false experience.
Other false experiences that subjects have been convinced to remember include placing a sticky substance into a teacher's desk and almost drowning and having to be saved by a lifeguard. But the real purpose of such studies is to illustrate how suggestive interviewing and information can influence memory in real life.
There have been in the past psychotherapists who unfortunately like to say to their patients or clients, you know, everyone I've seen with those symptoms was sexually abused as a child, and maybe something like that happened to you. And with enough suggestion that perhaps there's some sexual abuse in the history of the client or patient, some of these individuals have come to believe that they were molested by people that didn't do anything to them, that they sometimes had extreme experiences like being molested in satanic cults where they were forced into animal sacrifice.
All of which has led Loftus to the following conclusion.
Just because somebody reports a memory to you that's very detailed and very confident and about which they're very emotional doesn't mean it really happened.
Most of the time, our memory serves us well, but it's not a literal record of events and details from the past. As Dr. Loftus explained, memory is reconstructive and malleable. Not only can our memories change over time, but we can't even tell the accurate memories from the fabrications.
Okay, the air conditioning's back on, so you're probably hearing that again. I want to point out some really interesting things that happened in that last video, and that is that basically our memory is not as good as we think it is. It is actually really easy to trick our memory. Video I used to show, but I wanted to keep the videos to smaller size, so that's why I showed that one, to keep the file size down for the slides. But a video I used to show was basically they were showing a study showing how easy it was to implant false memories for even something big like a hot air balloon ride. So what they did is they had the families give these researchers a bunch of photos of the participants when the participants were kids, and they would take one of these photos and they would Photoshop the kid into a hot air balloon. The participant when they were a kid into a hot air balloon. They asked all the families to make sure, and none of the participants had been in a hot air balloon in their life. They brought these participants in and showed them these pictures and said, do you remember this picture? Do you remember this picture? Do you remember this picture? And all of the participants would say yes for most of them and no to the hot air balloon. And then they would bring them in a week later and ask them, do you remember these pictures now? And can you tell me about what's going on in these pictures? And after a week, and then they did it again after 2 weeks, and something like 80% of people after 2 weeks had vivid memories of being in a hot air balloon, even though they'd never been in a hot air balloon. And that's because their minds had constructed false memories. Their minds had constructed these memories of something that never happened. And it's really scary in some ways to think that our memories are that susceptible to suggestion and creating false memories. And I'm going to talk about flashbulb memories here, and then I'm going to give you a story about a false memory I have. So flashbulb memories, and the reason why that transitions into this is because we think we're really good at remembering flashbulb memories. Well, flashbulb memories are our vivid recollections, usually in great detail, of very dramatic or emotionally charged incidents. So these are memories that come with effortless encoding and are believed to last a long time. However, even though flashbulb memories feel very accurate to us, researchers have found that flashbulb memories, the actual detail of your memories and accuracy of your memories, degrade at the same rate as your other memories. So what you see here on the left or on the right is the dashed line is our everyday memory, the solid blue line is our flashbulb memory, and the number of details remembered after so many days. And as you can see, that number of details is still high early on at 1 day after, but the number of details you can remember goes down over time, and it goes down the same for flashbulb memories as it does for everyday memories. So again, these flashbulb memories, these things like being in a car accident, or where you were when a very dramatic thing happened, I sometimes use 9/11 as an example, but many of you, if not all of you, were probably too young now. But big events that happen like that everybody remembers. So going back, the Challenger explosion, the Kennedy assassination, walking on the moon, various different things like that in history have been flashbulb memories for the nation or for large groups of people. At the same time, you can have flashbulb memories that just involve you, and that is things like being in a car accident or having some other type of injury. What I'm trying to get at here, though, is that what we remember from flashbulb memories, it degrades in much the same way as normal everyday memories. However, what you see, so that's what's on the left. What you see on the right is the belief in the accuracy of your memories. So in this case, we've got the blue, solid blue still being flashbulb memories. At a day after the event, our belief of how accurate our memory is pretty similar between the two, between flashbulb memories and everyday memories. However, there is a big difference after 224 days, about 9 months, time that's gone by, and a big difference in the belief in how accurate our memories are. That is, our everyday memories, our belief in how accurate they are goes down. Our flashbulb memories, our belief in the accuracy of them stays the same. So that's just something to consider, because we look at the fact of, on the left here, our flashbulb memories do degrade just like our everyday memories. We get inaccuracies in them. But our belief in them doesn't fade. And that does get people in trouble. I always use myself as an example. So the flashbulb memory I have is of 9/11. And what is going on here is that I was at the time working third shift. I was working overnights, and that day, the day of 9/11, I slept until 3 p.m. The planes hit the towers at like 8 a.m., 9 a.m., very early in the morning. I was already asleep, and I was asleep when it occurred. However, I have very vivid memories of watching the second plane hit the second tower live on TV, watching it as it was happening. That is a false memory, 100% false memory. I was asleep at the time that happened, even though my mind, and I know it's a false memory, and I still have that as a memory. And that's, again, what's scary about these memories. I know that memory is false. I know that memory is not true. The memory probably got formed because it was being shown over and over and over again on TV for days after it occurred, and sometimes the live got left in the corner of the screen, even though it wasn't live, and really just my mind formed the memory of watching it occur live, even though I was asleep when that happened. And no matter how much I know that it's a false memory, it's still there in my mind as a memory. And whenever I think about anything else, any other memory I have, this is what I think about. That as good as I think my memory is, as accurate as I think it is, I've got a memory in my head that I know for a fact is a false memory. And it seems just as accurate as any other memory. So when if I have an argument with something about something that if I have an argument with someone about something that happened in the past, and I remember it one way, they remember it another way, I have to stop myself and think, well, I could be having a false memory here, and it's not really something that I should be arguing about, because of the fact of our minds are not as accurate as we would like to think they are. Okay, that's the end of this first set of slides. In the second set of slides, we'll finish with memory. We'll look at some more things with memory and how some more memory errors. We'll talk about Clive and amnesia and things like that. In this set of slides, we talked about memory. We looked at the types of memory, sensory, short-term, or as well as working, and then long-term. Within that, we looked at procedural and declarative, and within declarative, we looked at semantic and episodic, and we finished with encoding and a few problems with memory, of which we'll get to more of in the next slide. Thanks, come on back. In the second half of these slides, on remembering and forgetting, we're going to talk about remembering. We're going to look at some organization of memories, how memories are organized in the brain. We're going to talk about forgetting and things that cause forgetting. We're going to look at retrieval cues. We'll look at some of the biological basis for memory, some memorization methods, and finish up with eyewitness testimony and some of the issues with eyewitness testimony. So in this set of slides, we're looking more at the long-term memory side of things, as well as some things related to processing. So we have to bring up some of those things. We talked about retrieval. Well, when we're talking about retrieval, we need to have two different things. And retrieval, again, is retrieving something from long-term memory. We need to have, or we don't need to, but we're going to break that down into two different types of retrieval. Recall is the first one, and this is where we retrieve previously learned information without the aid of or with very few external clues. So this is when we recall some piece of information without an external clue about it. This is usually very effortful, where you're trying to think about something. I don't even really like the picture over here on the right. We're trying to recall with what's his name, where you're trying to recall something when you've got very few external clues. Well, if you're seeing the person, that's an external clue. This is more of, let's say I want you to retrieve information that you have about the state of Idaho. I've given you the cue of Idaho, but that is the only external cue you have. Now you might be thinking various different things, potatoes, Mormon church, various different things like that. But those are different things that you're recalling with very little external cues. Then you have recognition, where you identify previously learned information with the help of external cues. So this is more of what you see on the right of this one here, where you're the whole hello my friend, where you see a person, you remember them. So it's recognition, where you're taking this external cue, seeing them, and then remembering things about them. When it comes to memories, we organize our memories in a fairly complex way, actually. I had planned on drawing this all out, but it's how you see it here is one of the ways where we look at how our minds work. And what you've got over here is basically this interconnected network of information. So whenever we have, or whenever we're talking about information or the organization of information in our brain, we look at it in a very network-oriented way. That is, we store ideas in categories, and really these categories are almost looked at like nodes. So where we've got farm in the center. That is the node of farm. Now, yes, within the node of farm, it might make up a whole bunch of different things within that, but if we're talking about the memory for farm, we look at it as the node of farm. Then it's a giant interconnected network within there. And we have within this interconnected network, we have associations. These are the way nodes are linked together. Whenever we are bringing in new information into the brain, we link them via associations to information that already exists in our brain. When we talk about cognition next week, we'll look at this a bit more, but it's just one of those where we look at how information is in our brain, and memories are information, but how information in our brain is in these nodes, and anytime we're bringing in new information, we are associating it with information that's already there. And then this network is, again, I don't even like the word thousands. It's millions, billions of interconnected nodes forming a huge cognitive network for arranging and storing files. So we've got farm, but then we associate that farm with animals, machines, crops. Then we associate the crops or the animals with these different other nodes: horse, cow, goat, sheep. We associate crops with corn and wheat. But guess what? Corn could be associated with cow, because cows typically eat corn on farms. The other ones do as well. We could associate, we've got truck and tractor now. Well, tractor is what's used to gather crops. So, and then, even then, you've got tractor and truck might be associated together. The thing that I'm trying to get at here is that these associations, this picture that you had initially with farm, then crops, then animals, farm, then crops, then specific crops, farm, then machines, then specific machines, that isn't as good of a way to explain it, because our network is interconnected, meaning we don't just have straight connections. Let's say you want to add something new to this. Well, you've got a silo at the farm, or a barn. Let's say a barn at the farm. Well, so we've got now barn. Well, we can associate that directly with farm, but we associate it with animals as well, because animals stay in the barn. We associate it with crops as well, because we may store the crops in the barn. When we look at wheat, we look at hay from that, or straw, sorry, straw comes from wheat. After you cut the tops off from the wheat, you make straw from it. Now straw, well, you store straw in the barn. The horses may be in the barn. The horses are then laying on the straw in the barn. The point is that whenever something new comes into our mind, we make multiple associations, not just one line. You may park the truck and the tractor in the barn. So this new node is interconnected. It is interconnected to multiple different things. You don't just have these one ways of association. When we get to cognitive, we'll look at how there is some limits to this. There are some associations that are limited within scope, or limited within how we put them together, so they're not as much interconnected as they are. We follow these connections through multiple nodes, and we'll look at that when we get to cognition. But for now, just look at this organization of memories in a very interconnected way. We also have a hierarchy, and that is that we associate things in an order. So I said I'd get to, when we get to cognition, we'll really talk about this, but for now I can talk about it in a brief bit, in that the way we form these nodes in our mind, we tend to have overarching nodes, and then subnodes, and then subnodes within that. So if you're talking animal to bird to blue jay, yes, blue jays and roosters, you may have a way to associate them directly, but we've got these hierarchy of categories, or arrangement of nodes, a hierarchy of arrangement of nodes we tend to have in our mind. So if I ask you to, let's say, compare a shark to a blue jay, it is going to take your thinking longer, because you have to go all the way up to the node of the animal and then come all the way back down to the node of the blue jay. So you have to go all the way up this way and then all the way back down this way to get it there. And that's one of the ways we know that these nodes and these connections are the way they are to an extent, because if I ask you to compare a shark to a blue jay, it takes you longer to process than if I asked you to compare a shark to a guppy, in which it only has to go up one and down one level. There's more to it than that, and like I said, when we talk about cognition, we'll come back to it, but it does need to be noted that there is this hierarchy of nodes, with the bottom levels being the most specific, the top levels being the most generic. let's look at forgetting. So we're going to look at forgetting curves, and then we're going to look at some reasons for forgetting, things like that. So we're going to kind of jump around a bit in this chapter, but looking at these forgetting curves. So one of the biggest forgetting curve that almost everyone suffers from, there are some very rare exceptions, but for just about everyone, we have a forgetting curve with early memories. That is that you've got this basically anything before about 3.5 years old, except very traumatic memories, tend to be forgotten. And in some people it's even about 4 or 5 that you get into where you've got a lot of memories where you've only got a few flashes before that. But about 3.5 is about the earliest memory most people have, again, unless you've got a traumatic event. But if you go back to that previous set of slides, it's likely that you've had basically false memories there. So a lot of people that seem to recall something from before they were 3.5, what it turns out when it's dug deeper is those are as much in false memory domain as they are real memory domain. Also, things that are unfamiliar or uninteresting, this is information that is just as likely to not go into long-term memory. So when I was talking in the previous slides, I talked about that a bit, but it's also the easiest information to forget. And as I said before, it's not as much forgetting as it is not able to be retrieved, even though there is forgetting that does occur. But really what we're looking at is not being able to retrieve this information. The early memories, it's because that information doesn't properly encode. The brain isn't fully developed for encoding yet, so the encoding doesn't fully go into place, which is why we don't have early memories. Unfamiliar, uninteresting, part of it's because the encoding isn't that strong. Part of it's because we didn't find it interesting, so the mind doesn't process it at a deep enough level. And you look at over here on the right, nonsense syllables, which are going to be unfamiliar and pretty uninteresting. Time between learning and memory test, 1/3 of an hour, you only remember about 60%. 48 days later, remembering about 20%. And this is not just like being seen this list, this is being told to memorize this list and being given this. So you've got nonsense syllables, you've got a period of time, let's say 5-10 minutes, where you have to remember these. You're told to memorize this series of syllables, and then later you're asked to either recall them or you're given a list of nonsense syllables and asked which ones of these were the nonsense syllables you were asked to remember. And it goes down pretty quickly, and just over time it even goes down more. And so again, a lot of this is due to how familiar and interesting the information is. So that last slide was talking about forgetting, but also remembering is related. So remembering is related to how familiar or interesting the information is. And you see here, when you look at a recognition test and recall test on years since graduation for memory of names and faces. So this is going to be something that is relatively familiar and to some people interesting, but even then, after years and years since graduation, it does tend to decline. But on a recognition test, even after 47 years, that information doesn't decline. So the previous one, nonsense syllables, unfamiliar stuff, big decline in remembering. Information that we consider familiar or interesting, like the names and faces of people we went to high school with, it can tend to last years and years and years. Even if the general recall test, it goes down, the recognition test, when you're shown pictures, that is one of those, it can key the information, it can bring the information back. So the next thing is relating to reasons for forgetting. And a lot of what I've said, and we'll just continue that, a lot of what I've said about reasons for forgetting, why do we forget information, it's mainly due to it's not necessarily due to the information not being in the mind anymore, it's being due to not being able to retrieve the information. So this is where retrieval, recall, and recognition come in. The first is poor retrieval or cues or poor encoding can affect memory. So this is why poor encoding, here we're talking about early in life, you have poor encoding because of that we can't recall information from that period of time. But when we look at retrieval cues, again, mental reminders, types of things that help us associate between new information and information we already know. I talked about that a little bit on the previous slide when I was talking about people in high school being shown pictures. So that would be a retrieval cue. And retrieval cues can be something that is in the environment that we see, or something in our mind that we've created to help us bring that to the process, the current processing. And things like mnemonics, ocean, where that's the different, ocean was the one we talked about when we talked about personality, the big 5 personality traits. Well, that's a retrieval cue. And the better you are at forming retrieval cues, the better you will be at memory. Let's actually look at some of these. One of the things is this what's called tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you just feel that information is there, it's ready to be recalled. Even with great effort, though, you aren't able to recall that particular information. Well, what is going on here is that your retrieval cue is just not quite there. You need to, instead of trying to think in the direction you're thinking, try and think about it from a different direction. Usually what then will happen is you'll be able to recall it. So if you're having the tip of the tongue phenomenon, try not to get frustrated, because frustration actually decreases memory. Try to think about the problem from a different angle, and hopefully that'll get it there. Another big part of retrieval cues is what's called state-dependent learning. State-dependent learning is an interesting one. I talk about this every time, and I'm going to just give it the caveat, I don't recommend this, but what is state-dependent learning? State-dependent learning is when we find it easier to recall information when we're in the same emotional or environmental state as when we encoded it. It says here emotional, but it's also environmental. The same body position. However you are when you learn the information, when you encode the information, you should try to be as close to that as possible when retrieving it. They did a study on this, and that's what you see over here on the right. And what you see divided here is the dark blue is going to be sober at recall, the light blue is going to be drunk at recall. But what's important is whether the person was sober or drunk when they learned it. So what they did in this study is they got people to drink until they were past a certain blood alcohol level, or at it. When they do research on this, they try and get them right at a perfect blood alcohol level. So let's say they're trying to get them at 0.08. So they're getting them right to that perfect alcohol level, or not perfect, but right to that consistent alcohol level. So 0.08. And half of the people did that. The other half of the people drank water, and they were sober. And then after the people that were drunk got to 0.08, and the people that were sober after an adequate amount of time since drinking water had gone by, they had them learn a list of words or learn a task, something like that. So they have half of the people drunk at learning, half of the people sober at learning. Then a day later, they bring them all of the people back in the lab, and half of the people that were drunk at learning drink again. And half of the people that were sober at learning drink now. So now we're split into 4 categories. One category is people who were drunk at learning and drunk at now. The next is people who were drunk at learning and sober now. Then you had people that were sober at learning and are drunk now, and people that were sober at learning and are sober now. And how they did on the task is the very interesting thing here is that if you were sober when you learned it, and then you were sober when you recalled it, people did twice as well as those that were sober when they learned it and drunk when they recalled it. And the opposite, when drunk at learning, those who were drunk at learning and drunk at recall, they actually did 3 times better than those that were drunk at learning and sober at recall, showing that when the state they were in when they learned the task, that is whether they were drunk or sober, so the state they were in when they learned the task, when they went to perform, when they went to do the recall task, they did better if they were in the same state as they were when they learned it. So this is, again, and this isn't just for drinking, it's for all the different things. And this is where I always make the joke. I'm not encouraging anyone to drink. I want to make that perfectly clear. But I make the joke about if you're at home studying and you're drinking while you're studying, you should come in and take the test drunk. No, I'm not saying you should actually do that. It's a joke. I'm not encouraging anybody to drink. I actually, the thing you don't see here, or you can look at, is people did worse as being drunk than they did when they were sober. So drinking period actually impacts learning. I'm just getting at that the state you're in when you learn. So if you're learning, if you're practicing for a test, laying in bed, well, you're not, when you go to take the test, you're not laying in bed. So it's better to study laying down, because when you take the test, or it's better to study sitting up, sorry, because when you take the test, you're going to be sitting up. TV on in the background, music on in the background. You're not going to have that when you're taking the test. So having that on when you're studying actually puts you in a different state. The thing that's, and I told you I'd talk about different things that can help in memory, but the single biggest thing here that can help in memory that I always recommend to people is try to do your learning in as close of an environment as you can to the test. If you can come into the classroom, let's say you're taking the test in the classroom. Now, we're doing an online class, so it's a bit different, but if you're doing a test in a classroom, if you can study in that classroom, in the seat you sit at in that classroom, at the very similar time of day, all of that will aid in your recall immensely. Another reason for forgetting, so we went through the first one, now let's go through the second one. This is interference. This is where you have new memories that block old memories, or old memories that block the formation of new memories. So there's 2 different types of interference. One is proactive interference. This is when old information you learned earlier, blocks or disrupts new information. So you're learning something new. It's something on a topic, maybe you've learned some stuff before, but you're learning something new about it. Well, the information you had before actually can block you effectively learning the new information, especially if there's some differences. Or retroactive interference, that is when new information blocks or disrupts retrieval of old information. So you just learned something new, well, it makes you forget things that had happened before, or information you'd learned before. Next thing we're going to talk about is decay. So decay is where information in our memory basically decreases over time due to it just not accessing it. So over time, it becomes inaccessible due to disuse. This is also where certain memories, they become maybe fuzzier, not as distinct, because we just don't think about them over time, and as a result, like I said, they just tend to decrease in the long run. Next thing we'll look at real quick, and then we'll watch a video actually on it, is amnesia. So amnesia is essentially memory loss. It should be something all of you know, that amnesia is memory loss. But what isn't typically known is that amnesia can be temporary or permanent, and it can occur in multiple different ways. And we're not just talking about different ways that, like here, we're like it's after damage to the brain, a disease, anesthesia, certain drugs, psychological trauma. Another thing that causes amnesia is electroconvulsive therapy, which is something that's still used for things like depression. Basically, there's a couple different types of amnesia, but there is one thing that really needs to be looked at as a component here, and that is that one really big thing when we look at amnesia is that our mind is still encoding information for long after we think it's done. So we think, okay, something's in short-term memory, then we put it into long-term memory, and we look at that as almost an instantaneous process. However, what we know is that that's an hours-long process. From the time you experience an event, let's say you're watching this lecture, to the time that it is fully into long-term memory, could be 4 or 5 hours. It might be less, but it could be that long. That is why things like a blow to the head, so where you have a damage to the head, so a blow to the head can cause loss of a small chunk of long-term memory. It's because it stopped those memories from encoding into long-term memory, so that period of time is gone from memory because those memories never encoded, never fully encoded. And that's the electroshock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy. That's one thing that happens is it basically stops the encoding. So for a period of time, you've got memory loss, stuff like that. There are two main types of amnesia. That is retrograde and anterograde. Retrograde is loss of memory for things that happened prior to the trauma. Anterograde is loss of ability to form new memories. Far and away the most common is retrograde. So retrograde is typically what is looked at as when we look at amnesia, it's retrograde. Anterograde, though, is also possible, and that is inability to form new memories. And again, I have to go back. It could be temporary, it could be permanent. Typically, amnesias are going to be of the permanent nature unless it's a problem with making associations. So those things in the brain, we can't make associations with them until we fix something, and then we can make associations with them again. But typically, what you're looking at with amnesia is a permanent loss of a chunk of memory because those memories didn't consolidate. So again, looking at retrograde's the most common type of amnesia, but far and away the most common type of retrograde amnesia is a block or period of time immediately preceding a blow to the head or something like that, alcohol, things like that, that cause basically for you to black out. That is a period of time where the memories did not fully consolidate, and no amount of thinking or working or going to therapy is going to get those memories back because they didn't fully encode in the brain. That retrograde amnesia of forgetting everything prior to the traumatic event, that's much less common, and that's the one where you're more typically going to be able to remember it with work, with therapy, things like that, because the memories are still there, you just can't access them, unlike that short retrograde amnesia. Which, I'm mentioning short and long, I should really point out here that Hollywood gets this wrong all the time. When Hollywood says short-term memory loss, what they actually mean is long-term memory loss. Short-term memory, again, is 30 seconds. It's not going to be short-term memory loss unless they're just 30 seconds. So the movie Memento talks about short-term memory loss. But actually, in actuality, he has perfect short-term memory. He has very good short-term memory. His only problem is he doesn't have any long-term memory. He has actually anterograde amnesia. He cannot form new memories. He remembers everything prior to a certain event, but he cannot form new memories after that. On the next slide is a very interesting video on Clive. If you're interested in more of it, I'll talk about that after the video. But Clive has both retrograde and anterograde amnesia. He has both loss of all memory prior to the event that caused memory loss, and he has the inability to form new memories. Watch that. I really recommend it.
Do you know how we got here?
No.
You don't remember sitting down?
No.
I reckon we've been here about 10 minutes at least.
Well, I've no knowledge of it. My eyes have started working now, and all I've seen the whole time I've been seeing anything at all is that.
And do you feel absolutely normal?
Not absolutely normal, no. Completely confused.
Confused?
Yes. We've never eaten anything, never tasted anything, never touched anything, or smelled anything. What right have you assumed we're alive?
But you are?
Well, apparently, yes. But I'd like to know what the hell's been going on.
Clive was an outstanding musician.
He would take his work very, very seriously. At the same time, he loved music so much that he just really threw himself into it totally.
Clive was a musician of enormous integrity.
He was the world's expert on lassos, one of the 3 or 4 great composers of the Renaissance.
And he also worked a great deal in contemporary music and was chorus master of the London Sinfonietta, which was Europe's foremost group.
Music flows out of him, whether he's singing or playing or conducting.
Clive Waring, through a cruel twist of fortune, shows us how fundamental consciousness and memory are to our lives.
Well. No surprise. Isn't that? It's a smashing surprise. I've not seen you before.
I don't know. You've not seen me before?
No. This is the first time.
You pleased to see me?
Oh, bet I am. There's nobody else I care about in the world as a whole.
Oh, darling. So how are you feeling this morning?
I'm conscious for the first time. It's the first time I've seen anybody at all.
You've not been conscious before? No. I've been here before this
I
morning.
haven't seen you before.
No, you haven't?
No. I've not seen anything at all before. I've been completely blind the whole time. No taste, so this is the first taste I've had.
That's the first coffee you've had?
Yes. Cheers.
Cheers. And how are you seeing things?
Absolutely normally. The first time.
Full colour?
Yes. I've never seen anything the whole time I've been ill. No black and white, nothing.
Do you remember me arriving?
No. I don't remember any arrival at all. I don't remember writing any of that. Nothing to do with me consciously. I mean, unconscious writing.
What are you doing here?
Well, I don't know, presumably playing patience, but I mean, that's the first time I've seen any cards.
Is it?
Yes.
Do you remember starting the game?
No.
It all started with a headache. Clive came home one day and said he had a very bad headache. The headache didn't lift, it didn't respond to analgesics. By the 4th day, he developed quite a high fever. And on the evening of the 4th day, for a little while, he forgot his daughter's name. By the 5th day, he was very delirious.
Clive suffered from viral encephalitis, which has led to the damage of the left and the right temporal lobes, plus a good portion of the left frontal lobe. And the temporal lobes contain a structure called the hippocampus, which we know is implicated in memory function, and in Clive it has almost certainly been completely destroyed in both sides of his brain. It's this that's primarily responsible for his severe memory impairment. In addition, the damage to his frontal lobes also causes a number of additional memory problems, which are manifest mostly in terms of him repeating himself a lot and generally showing highly emotional behaviour.
Clive's world now consists of a moment with no past to anchor it and no future to look ahead to. It is a blinkered moment. He sees what is right in front of him, but as soon as that information hits the brain, it fades. Nothing makes an impression, nothing registers. Everything goes in perfectly well because he has all his faculties, his intellect is virtually intact, and he perceives his world as you or I do. But as soon as he's perceived it and looked away, it's gone for him. So, it's a moment-to-moment consciousness, as it were, a time vacuum. And everything before that moment is completely void. And he feels as if he's awakening afresh the whole time.
Lovely hand you've got. Beautiful, marvellous tickets. Fantastic. I'm awake for the first time. You're the first person I've seen.
It's very nice to meet
How
you.
long has it been?
It's been about 2.5 years now, Mr. Graham.
Imagine one night, 2.5 years long.
One moment.
So it's been night. Not seen anything till now. Not even anything before this game. I've given the impression of being consciously awake. Not true.
He always thinks he's been awake for about 2 minutes. And that's why he looks at his watch all the time to record it, to record the fact, I've woken up, this is an important event, therefore I will write it down in my diary. So he writes, 11:54 a.m. I am now completely awake for the first time. And he underlines first time. Patience begins, because he's always playing patience. And the whole diary, every page, is a succession of entries saying almost the same thing, of first awakeness. And when he goes back and looks at his own entries, he doesn't acknowledge that they are genuine. He says he knows it's his handwriting, but as far as he's concerned, he was unconscious when he wrote them. So he quite often, he'll score out what he's written before. And so his life is an ever-repeating moment of first awakening. The strongest thing in his life, I believe, and his diaries bear that out, is his love for me. And that's absolutely raw. And each time I walk into that room, it is as if it's the first time he's seen me for years.
Good heavens above! Well, darling.
Hello. You surprised to see me?
The first time I've seen anybody at all. The first person I've seen.
You've not seen me before this morning?
No, I haven't.
I have been here. So how are you feeling this morning?
I'm conscious for the first time. It's the first time I've seen anybody at all.
You've not been conscious before? No. I've been here before this morning.
I haven't seen you before.
No, you haven't?
No. I've not seen anything at all before. I've been completely blind the whole time.
You don't remember me arriving at all?
No. No, I don't remember that you arrived at me at all.
No.
No idea at all.
But do you know who I am? Or do you kiss all women like that?
You know I love you. I don't kiss anybody
Yes,
else.
I do know. I do know. You've written them all over your diary. Look. I bet you that if I look to see what you've written, you haven't mentioned me on that page.
No.
You've mentioned me on this page. My first thought, I adore Deborah for eternity.
That's right.
People's entries in the diary are rubbish. What does that mean?
I've no idea.
Did you write that?
I've no conscious knowledge of it at all, no. You're showing it me now for the first time.
But is it your handwriting?
Yes, it is. But I know nothing about it at all.
So how do you think it got there?
I do. I presume the doctors don't know.
But you must...
No, I haven't. You listen to me, please, for heaven's sake. When I say no, I mean exactly that. I haven't seen the book at all till now.
No, all I'm saying...
No, that means I haven't seen it, I have no knowledge of it at all. That's all. There's no knowledge of that book at all. It's entirely new to me.
But
But just use your intelligence, and let's have a comment which is intelligent.
But you've put... Who would put that if I...
I don't know, but no. Oh, for heaven's sake, use your intelligence, for heaven's sake. I haven't read the bloody thing. Well, use your intelligence.
Clive gets extraordinarily angry, and who wouldn't? Because here you're not dealing with somebody who is demented, who is oblivious, who is gaga. You are dealing with a perfectly lucid, highly intelligent man who has been robbed of knowledge of his own life, and he feels deeply humiliated to be put in that position. Very, very frustrated that he can't grasp what's wrong with him, because even as you're telling him, he's forgetting the previous sentence.
I could talk about Clive all day long. As I said, I talk about one specific thing after the video. That is the first in a two-parter of the videos about Clive. If you're more interested, if you're still interested in Clive, go check out on YouTube the second video. There's actually another video of him that's like 10 years later that you can watch. Just some interesting things that happened. His wife actually divorced him and then remarried him, and even years later, every time she walks in the room, he acts the same way. And it's just really interesting to see how the mind works when we can't form new memories, nor do we have any memories of the past. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier in the first set of slides on how we know there's a difference between episodic memories and our semantic, in that it comes down to the fact that he remembers his wife, but he doesn't remember ever being with her in the past. He remembers her name, but he doesn't remember what happened 2 minutes ago. So it's just really one of those where it shows these different systems that are there and how he has certain types of memory. He can still play the piano. I don't think they showed that in that video, but they show it in the next video that in the series, as well as the video later in life. He can play the piano perfectly because he was a composer. He played the piano. He still knows how to play the piano. So there's certain things he can still be taught. Like if you do something repetition over and over and over again, he doesn't remember ever doing it before, but there's certain skills, like muscle memory skills, he can be taught by doing it over and over again, even if he never remembers doing it before. I always wondered what it would be like to teach him the muscle memory to do like a card trick, and how amazed would he be when you have him do the card trick and he's like, I don't know how to do a card trick. You hand him a deck of cards and he does a card trick. I just think that would have been an interesting thing to do. So Clive is interesting. He's one of only 2 cases very similar to him. The other one is HM. If you're interested in more, cognitive psych looks at these types of things much more in depth. Okay, so let's look at the biological basis of memory, because it was kind of discussed in that video. So where are memories located in the brain? Most memories are located in the cortex. This is where we store short-term and long-term memories. This is where working memory happens. When we talk about emotions, our emotional memories are in the amygdala. And then we also have to talk about the hippocampus, which is where we transfer information from the short-term into long-term memory. Clive had damage to his hippocampus, so he could not form new long-term memories. And he also had damage that caused him to not be able to retrieve long-term memories. So it's just really interesting in that context of how much things like the hippocampus play a role in memory. I talked about this already, but we'll look at it real quick. What are things you can do to improve your memory? One of them is mnemonics. So where you basically create better retrieval cues. Like I said, ocean for the big 5 personality traits. Another method people do is methods of loci. This is where we create an association between an already memorized place and new items to be memorized. In ancient times, people would have to give long speeches, things like that. They didn't have access to writing them down. How would they remember everything they were going to talk about? Well, one of the methods they used was the method of loci. That is, they would imagine a palace, and you learn this palace or a house or whatever it is, and you've got all of these rooms. So you learn this, and you learn this really well. And then when you have to memorize a new thing, well, in each room of the palace, you put a piece of information. So in your mind, in this room is talking about the grains. In this room is talking about taxes. In this room is talking about that. And by making those associations in your mind between each of those rooms and one item to talk about, then it allows for easier remembering of all the things you need to talk about. And then as you're giving your speech, in your mind, you walk through your house into each of these rooms and you recall that information. Another is the PEG method. This is where we associations between rhymes, different number word things, different, basically different ways of creating associations in the mind that allow us to retrieve it easier. Let's talk real quick now about some implications of memory and what some of the things happen with memory. So I talked in the previous set of slides about how our memories are notoriously bad. We tend to forget things. We tend to think we remembered something when it was false, those types of things. Well, this is a perfect example of it. And this is a research study where they looked at people's sexual histories. And the participants were surveyed at 2 times, 1 year apart, about their sexual histories. And what ended up happening is many students changed what they'd said about their sexual history. They changed from the first reporting of it to the next. So adolescents who'd had intercourse after taking a virginity pledge were much more likely to deny ever having taken the pledge in the first place. Even if in the first assessment they said they'd taken the pledge, they get to the second assessment, they said they never took the pledge. And then adolescents who had intercourse before taking a pledge were likely to deny sexual histories. Even going on, respondents basically experienced belief change between the 2 measures, and basically the recall was aligned to their current beliefs. So if your beliefs, if your belief in what is right and wrong, your belief in what should be done, what shouldn't be done, those types of things, if they change, that can actually cause your recall of events and things you did to change. Our minds actually go back and retroactively change memories of our past behaviors to better fit our current belief system and morality. You see this with some people who will have had sex and then will go back and deny ever having sex, and they don't remember it. Or it should say not just straight sex, we'll say where you've got people who did things related to sex and then will deny ever having done anything sexual because their current belief system. And you see this even with things like politicians and stuff, where they deny doing things that they clearly did, that we have on record that they did in the past. And it's because their beliefs changed. And you see this with people who, as they get older, people tend to become more conservative. People will deny doing things earlier in life that they've done because it doesn't fit their new ideology. So when we're looking at this, it's just something to be aware of, that we go back and retroactively, not intentionally, this is a subconscious thing that happens, but we go back and subconsciously, retroactively alter our memories to fit our current ideology. Another thing to talk about when we're talking about issues of memory is eyewitness testimony. So eyewitness testimony refers to recalling or recognizing like a suspect or an incident, and it's during a time that could be potentially disruptive, distracting, emotional, and what we find is that can have a lot of interference or a lot of effect on our memory. We get things wrong with eyewitness testimony. I'm going to talk about it on a couple slides here, but the one thing I'm going to say just from the beginning, it is of my belief that eyewitness testimony is not a valid reason to convict someone of a crime just because of how bad we actually are with eyewitness testimony. So even in the picture you've got here, the guy on the left was the one who committed a rape. The one on the right was the one who eyewitness testimony said committed the rape and who was eventually convicted of it until evidence came out that it wasn't him. So eyewitness testimony got this wrong. Now this could be due to identifying individuals, when we could go into a whole racism thing here and looking at how people are notoriously bad at identifying others of other races, especially if they're not around them often. If we're around them often, we get good at it. I always talk about, when I'm talking about things like this, I spent 15 months in Korea, and by the time I was at the end of 15 months in Korea, I could look at a person and tell whether they were Chinese, Japanese, or Korean ancestry. I can't do that anymore because it's been so long, it's been a while since I've been in Korea. But while I was there, at the end of when I was there, I could make that identification. And someone who grows up in those areas can make that identification. We are notoriously bad, though, at identifying slight differences in people who are of a racial makeup that we don't see on an everyday basis. When we're looking at eyewitness testimony, so we looked at one case where it's wrong, here's another case where it's wrong. This one's an even more interesting one. So in 2008, a commuter train crashed with a freight train in LA. Did the train legally pass through a green light or illegally pass through a red light? Well, all 4 eyewitnesses reported that the signal for the train was green. Later evidence, though, video evidence that isn't eyewitness, indicated that the signal that the train operator went through was red and that the driver had been texting. So, and he was later found guilty of murder. But the point here is that 4 eyewitnesses all said the same thing, that the light for the train was green. But video evidence showed that they were wrong. So it's just one of those that even if we rely on eyewitnesses for even things like this, where we're not talking about somebody who is personally involved, stuff like that, you really get to the fact that eyewitnesses can be incorrect. Things like, can the questions change the answers? I talked about this a little bit last week, but this is just one of those interesting things where we get things like the misinformation effect. This is where misleading or false information can change a person's memory. You can actually change a person's memory by giving them information prior to asking them a question. So if you were to ask a question, do you remember, and it was in one of those videos a little bit ago, but do you remember seeing the stop sign? Well, that's misleading information because you're now putting into their mind a stop sign. If you ask them, well, what signs did you see, or what did you see? If you just ask them free association like that, then they might recall or not recall a stop sign. But if you say, did you see a stop sign? What we know from that is people are likely to say, yes, they saw a stop sign, even if there wasn't a stop sign for an accident. Stuff like that. We also do source misattribution, where we have difficulty deciding which of 2 sources of memory came from. So is it something that a person saw or imagined, or is it a suggestion? Did it come from that event, or is it something else? This is actually a interesting test that you can do where you can be given a list of names. And then I give you this list of names, and then a week from now I ask you, is this person a famous person? And I give you a on this list who's famous, and I give you one name after another and ask you if they're famous. All of the names from the first list are not famous people, first of all, I should say. That list I gave a week before. So I give you a list a week before. None of the people on that list are famous. Then a week later I ask you, is this a famous person? Is this a famous person? Is this a famous person? You are more likely to say that the names that were on that list are famous than you are to say that they're not, because it's a familiarity thing. We tend to associate familiarity with fame, and now those names are in your mind, so those names get associated with familiarity. We associate those names with famous people. That's just another type of thing where you can get this source misattribution. We think that the name is famous because we've seen it before, that type of thing. So what should we do? What technique works best for questioning eyewitnesses to get the best information? Basically, free association. So asking them to reconstruct and report everything they remember and hold nothing back without actually giving them any prompts or any asking any specific questions. Just asking an eyewitness, tell me everything you saw. Tell me everything you can. Don't hold anything back. Also, having people narrate the events from a different viewpoint has been shown to be very effective in helping eyewitnesses remember things. So asking them, so what would you have seen if you were in the car? What would you have seen if you were standing on the other side of the street? That type of thing. So narrate the event from different viewpoints. Recalling the incident from backwards to forwards in time instead of forwards to backwards. Changing perspective, context, reporting everything. These are all things that can aid in helping with reporting for different types of things, because even though at the beginning I said I'm not a big fan of eyewitnesses for convicting people, a lot of the time that's all we have. We're getting into an age where we've got more cameras, but a lot of the times that's all we have. Because of that, that is what we end up having for doing things like convictions. So we still need to rely on eyewitnesses. I would just warn a jury that any eyewitness testimony may be inaccurate because people are not as good at memory as they believe they are. Okay, in this set of slides, we talked about remembering, we talked about the organization of memories, we looked at forgetting, some retrieval cues, we looked at where memory takes place in the brain, some tips for memorization, and finished up with eyewitness testimony. Thanks, come on back.